We have this expression when you're kind of drowning in the water, it's hard to look around and see how anybody else is doing, you know? So if you're really thrashing around and confused and overwhelmed and alarmed, it's not a place from which to make major decisions.
Hi, my name is Mina Kim, your host of the Klickline. I've worked on Wall Street for over 14 years. Then I built out Orange Theory Fitnesses and sold them to a private equity firm. And upon that exit, started investing in women and minority startups, as well as advising women who are getting through divorce with financial consulting and strategy. Welcome to the Klickline. Today we have Elana Katz. She is an EFT trainer, which stands for Emotionally Focused Therapy, at the New York Center of EFT, and a senior faculty member at the Ackerman Institute for the Family. She is a licensed social worker and licensed marriage family therapist who trains therapists, divorce coaches, and mediators worldwide. So I like to refer to her as the internationally known emotionally focused therapist. Thank you and welcome to the Klickline, Elana.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you being here. So if you could, for the audience, talk about what is emotionally focused therapy exactly?
So that's one of my passion really is emotionally focused therapy. I was a card-carrying family therapist for many decades before I stumbled into EFT by accident and have never left. And it is a really brilliantly devised model developed by Sue Johnson, the late Sue Johnson. And it really says that if we can focus on the emotional cues and experience, people really have a lot of wisdom inside about what's going on for them. And we use that emotional knowledge and we use the fact that, as I often say, so far, every client I've worked with is a mammal. So I can count on the mammalian wiring, which says we are wired for connection. Mammals don't do well in isolation, so we can count on that mammalian wiring, on that attachment wiring, and using the knowledge that's been developed in EFT to really help people understand themselves and change disruptive patterns in their lives.
And so when you talk about attachments, I've seen different research or information on attachment styles. Can you go more into that? Like, when does that actually develop and what are the styles?
Generally, people have one of two stylistic responses to stress or conflict. They're the people who in distress are going to lean in and they're going to energize and they're going to try more to be understood, to understand you, to make something happen. And there are the people in distress who will tend to lean back, shut down, go seemingly quiet, from the outside, right? I also, when I'm teaching, I carry in my slide deck a picture of a broken walk sign from New York City, which has the walk symbol and the do not walk symbol showing at the same time. And I said, because there are people, it's a bit less common, who will seemingly almost show both signals at the same time. They do a bit of both, but most likely people are one or the other.
And this develops in early childhood.
This develops early on. There's no right or wrong. It's a way to kind of regulate against distress. The only thing that makes it challenging is that sometimes it's hard in relationship to read the signal. So somebody who's energized and trying to get through to a partner gets more and more hyped up, and the other person is in distress and shutting down and not yet able to explain it. So you can read that as my partner's overwhelmed. You could read that as my partner's disinterested. You could read that as my partner's confused. You could read that as my partner's preoccupied with somebody else they know at work. In other words, it's a confusing signal because it's a shutdown. So the other person doesn't really know what's going on.
So how do you work with the person who is shut down?
Carefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how do you work with them to extract, the emotion and feeling and identify what's going on?
So I can think of someone I worked with a while back who would get very shut down. She was actually in the mid stages of working on a divorce process. And in distress, she would get very quiet. So it could look like the person's refusing to participate in the process. The person doesn't understand the process. I was able to work with her to understand that she had a lot to say. She was actually doing quite a bit of thinking, and she needed sort of some clear space to be able to come forward and express herself. But without clarifying that, without making that obvious to the other professionals involved, it could look like she's just stonewalling the process. So I had to say things like, if you get really still right now, what are you feeling inside? What thought goes through your mind as you hear X, Y, and Z? I could clear a space and show her that I really did believe that she had a lot to say. She came forward tremendously. She was able to really do a great job of shaping, including her input in what was ultimately a divorce settlement.
I'm sure you've also have had more challenging clients where they may be more difficult, maybe even defensive. How do you break down those walls? I mean, I'm sure that takes more time, but...
Yeah. Well, again, it's a part of it is, I think of internally, I'm kind of feeling like a Geiger counter. So if somebody is really agitated, really escalated, I can't say, oh, this seems hard. You probably have a lot going on, because they'll just eat me like yesterday's lunch, If somebody's really escalated, I have to move in a much more present, my voice changes, I lean forward. I said, wow, this is intense. You have a lot that you're feeling right now. You have a lot to say. Let me make sure I'm getting you exactly. So I do something I call affect matching, where I'm really trying to attune my emotional presence to what will be most helpful to the person in front of me.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's different, right? It's very different than the blank face therapist who's just and taking some notes, right?
Yeah. And so once you help them identify the emotion that they're feeling and understanding, and the negative pattern that they're in, how do they apply this? Because practice makes perfect, but how do they practice this ongoing when they're not with you, right? How do people do that?
Well, it starts by actually doing just what you intuitively said, which is it starts by practicing. So if someone's there in couples therapy and their partner is there, we do something that can either be called an enactment or an encounter, where someone may have said to me, it's not that I don't have an idea about what I think would be good for our relationship. I just get hopeless that I won't be heard. So they might say that to me, or I might have had to help them distill to get to a place where they would say that. So I said, that is super important. You're saying, I don't know if you will hear me. I don't know if you will really listen. Tell me more about that. And I really help them develop that whole experience. And then I say, could you turn to your partner now? And in your own really important words, could you share from that place, which is, I don't feel like I will be heard, or I don't always know that my words will matter, or in other words, it's got to be a little bit more about the self. There's no value added in having the client turn to the partner and say, you're such a jerk, you never listen. That will not add value to the relationship. But if they say, I always doubt whether my words really matter. I always doubt whether my thinking is good enough. Something happens if they can share with vulnerability about the self. It does transform relationships if you can have repeated experiences of doing that over time. And I also help the partner to be attuned and responsive.
That's great. But so what about when there's infidelity, which is such a highly, emotionally charged situation?
Very charged. Very charged.
I mean, can someone really work towards trusting someone again and maintaining that relationship? How do you work with couples who experience that?
Well, the first place I go is I feel like something should always become understandable. It may or may not be forgivable, but the first stop on the train, if you will, is how do we make something like this understandable? What was happening inside the person who stepped out of the relationship? What was happening in the relationship? Because there are so many different experiences that people have. I've heard everything from, you seemed so busy, I actually thought you would prefer it, that I wasn't putting pressure on our relationship anymore. You just seem so preoccupied. I got tired of asking, and you seem to like it that I didn't turn to you so much anymore. To as inexplicably as it sounds, somebody saying, I just sort of was giving up on myself. I just felt like, is this all I am? I don't feel like I'm that interesting. I don't feel like I've done anything new in a long time. All of a sudden, somebody comes along who sees me in a different way. 2, this really was a crisis in our relationship, something we were not connecting anymore, right? And what's striking is the other person may have an entirely different experience. So before we can even begin to try to heal a relationship, we have to at least understand each person's experience of what happened.
And so when something emotionally charged like this happens, what physically happens to your brain, to your body, where you can't make sound decisions?
Well, again, when you're kind of, they have this expression, when you're kind of drowning in the water, it's hard to look around and see how anybody else is doing, So if you're really thrashing around and confused and overwhelmed and alarmed, it's not a place from which to make major decisions. So again, first step is, can we understand this? And can each person's experience be understood? And then can be the question of, if the partner is in a lot of pain, they really need to know that their pain matters to the partner who stepped out of the relationship. That is an incredibly important part of the healing. They see that the pain they feel, they see that reflected in the partner's eyes. If we have done our job well as therapists and built an understanding of what happened and a sharing of what happened, the healing then comes in knowing that your pain really matters.
Right. And so I have clients who are women who are in the process of getting divorced, who I advise in financially, strategically. And a common theme is where they're paralyzed in decision making, and that's where I help them. And it could, be the whole spectrum of, people who have been doing their own businesses for many years, who have very advanced careers and they're wicked smart at what they do. But this emotional trauma is paralyzing, right? When you're going through this process. So what advice do you give these women and men who are, beginning to go through this process, or if they're dealing with something emotionally traumatic, in helping them kind of filter through the emotions and trying to get out of the water?
I mean, I often say really no one should be able to handle all the processes of divorce when you think about it, because it's kind of, the alarm bells are ringing. I'm not talking about the couple who's been essentially living separate lives for 6 or 7 years, and they say, we really should kind of formalize this, and they come to legal advisors to get the paperwork done. But the separateness has long been acclimated to, and they moved on, and they've even stayed friendly. Every once in a while I meet a couple like that, but they're the exception. What often happens is there's someone who's initiated the process and someone else who's responding, right? The initiator may have been contemplating this for quite some time, thinking about, I'm really not happy. This isn't working. Oh my God, it has to work. Of course, I'll try harder. No, it's not. And that can go on for quite a period of time. Whereas the other person might have said, listen, we're not doing great, but I just kind of assumed we had a lot of stress. The kids are really challenging stages, or work is really hard right now. And I just for sure thought we were going to get through it, right? And so for the person who was really in shock and didn't think it was going to happen, didn't see it coming, it's kind of like asking somebody with a high fever to go on a blind date. It's kind of like, who would possibly want to do that? So you're going through this very alarming phase, and there's a lot of information to absorb. You have to, if you haven't been familiar with the financial workings of your family, you have to get familiar. You have to be able to understand it. You have to digest it. You have to be able to make decisions about it, right? So all that, part of what we can do is just normalize that. It makes sense that it is really hard to do this right now. It makes sense that your emotional brain is just kind of flooded with all kinds of difficult memories, flashbacks, fears, worries. And at the same time, here we are. So sometimes just explaining to people about the different parts of the brain and how it makes sense that when they're in their most distressed place, it's going to be hard to be reflective, but also to say to people, staying in the dark is also triggering, right? For someone who has not had a handle on all that, information is power. Information is helpful. Saying, oh, this is something I can make sense of. Right? So for the person who's wicked smart, knows the spreadsheet, but isn't getting there, normalizing that for them, helping them understand that given what they're going through emotionally, it's really hard to get there. And for the person who thinks, I could never get there, I could never be that informed, step by step going through that work can be calming. They can get to a point where they said, I don't think I ever wanted this to be in this place, but I see that I can understand this place and I can make sense of it. And I understand what the decisions are that need to be made for us to get to a settlement agreement. Now, I do want to throw in there that when it comes to divorce, we are not 50 United States. We are almost like 50 countries. So divorce law does change state by state. So talking to a friend about their divorce can be problematic because it's not predictive of what might be happening in one's own situation, but especially if they're in a different state, the guidelines can be dramatically different. So I just think that's worth noticing.
Are there some examples of that, how it's dramatically different?
Yeah, for example, and again, I practice almost exclusively in New York. I also do some work in New Jersey, but I come from the Midwest, so I hear stories about the guidelines, for example, for if there's a huge disparity or even a sizable disparity in income between the people getting divorced, that sometimes can be grounds for spousal support. So the higher earning person will pay what used to be called alimony, what in New York is generally referred to as spousal support now. But the length of time for support could be very different in New York compared to another state. So it's really worth making sure that a person doesn't try to extrapolate from anecdotal stories they've heard from someone who's living in another place. It's probably never a good idea to try to extrapolate, but something like that's a really, one item that's often a very important item.
Yes, I agree. I know that in California, there's certain calculations based off of how many years you've been married and things like that. And New York is different. And so also another reason why I always mention that it's so important to have a good team in place, your own matrimonial attorney, your own therapist, your own accountants, your own wealth manager, all of these things in place so you can have a holistic view on your specific situation and not just off of, whatever friends may mention stories you see online. Or
friends can mean very well, but when they say, you make sure that you get 15 years of spousal support, don't settle for a month less. Well, that might happen, but it might not happen at all. It really does depend on the guidelines and where you live. And also, even in New York, which is very highly litigious context, only about 3% of divorces go all the way to trial where they are settled in court. A lot of times cases look like they're going to court, but people do settle in advance. People settle on the courthouse steps. So most of the time we're going to be talking about what does the settlement look like, not what did a judge decide was fair. And I really try to support people if they can to land in a process where there isn't as much wear and tear on posturing as if we are going to court, because it is depleting. It's depleting emotionally and it's depleting financially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's a good example of, sometimes people are so angry and emotionally charged. They're like, screw this jerk. I'm going to take him all the way to court and, I get revenge or whatever it is. And that at the end may not be worth it. And it's not going to be.
May not even be doable because
exactly, yeah.
Most states, I wish I had the number for you, the reasons for the divorce are not braided together with the terms of settlement. So even if you say, I'm going to prove this was all your fault, all those old movies of private investigators with flash photography, like lurking around hallways and creating documentation of bad behavior, is in many, many states completely irrelevant to the terms of the divorce.
Right. And, you have to remember the judges are overloaded with cases. There's a backlog of cases in the system. They have 20 minutes to make a decision. And oftentimes and so you don't know what will happen. And so this is why it's important to have someone like you on a team where you can really zone in on the emotionally charged aspect of the divorce and the process, so that doesn't interfere with decision making, right? And really working through this beforehand. So, I'm curious, I know every situation is different, but how long does it take for someone to dissect and break down, because their emotional patterns, because it may have been happening, they have this pattern for 30, 40, 50 years, right?
So what I usually say to people is, in a couple of months' time, you'll be able to tell whether this approach feels like a fit for you. Does it making sense? Do you feel like I'm getting it? Do you feel like you're getting yourself? The length of time it takes to change an important pattern and be able to, and the gold standard for us in EFT, switching back to the therapy side of the street, is that people are able to share from a place of vulnerability and respond to each other in that place. So a fight that might have sounded like, "What's wrong with you? Who walks in the door after 8 o'clock at night?" And all you have to say for yourself is, "Isn't there anything for dinner?" If we have, I'm being stereotypical, but if we have fights that over and over, go to, "You screwed up because there's nothing in, can't even have a house where there's food in the house. And you screw up because you don't even know how to get yourself in the door before 8 o'clock. I had one client say to me, "I'm so glad we have a dog, because that way I know that there'll be something there who is happy that I've come in the door," So if we're starting out from a place of mutual blame and accusation, a good chunk of the work is really understanding that we are unwittingly each one is triggering the other into a cycle that is not serving the relationship.
Ooh, that's a good one.
So that's a big chunk of the work. And then being able to speak. So that fight, that stereotypical fight, could, after a chunk of work, person could get to a place where they say, "When I come in and I complain, it triggers my partner in such a way that they feel bad, but what they do is they shout back. When they shout back, I get louder because I feel like you're not getting me. And I get louder. You get more hurt, more defensive. I feel more like an outsider. Only the dog wants me. So I get louder too." And we understand we're triggering each other. Nobody's winning this one. So it takes a while to see just that there's that pattern, right? And then we can get to a place of, when I come in the door and I feel like it's only the dog who's glad that I walked in the door, I feel so small. I can feel so unimportant. I feel like, the plants on the shelf get more attention and are more appreciated than I am. And I don't get it. I don't know, how did I mess up? Why do I matter so little? They can speak from a place of what the vulnerability is, not just the irritation, but the vulnerability. Usually when people are de-escalated, one person can share vulnerability, the other person will respond to that vulnerability. And that's what builds a secure relationship. And I would say that people are doing great if they can do that work in a year's time.
Okay, that's great to know. And so would you recommend, when you work with a couple, do you recommend one of the partners has a separate therapist and you're working with the couple and one of them, or how does that work?
Generally not. Generally not. I mean, sometimes there's a chunk of work that gets triggered that says, this place of feeling like I don't matter, that I'm unimportant. It's something I've carried since I'm 5 years old, and I never worked it out with my family. We just have this kind of pro forma relationship. I show up at holidays. We call each other once every X, but and they really have a chunk of work that's outside of the marital work that they really want to do. Of course, one informs the other, but they may really want to do some of that work separately, right? But most of the time, I want to make sure that somebody is bringing the vulnerability they feel into the relationship. If they're outsourcing that, if that's all going into a separate channel, it may be riskier to share it with their partner. And so they say, well, I don't have to go here. I can talk about it on Tuesdays at 4 when I have my own therapy, right? So I actually want to keep the emotional energy in a space where I can hopefully get them to a place where they can hear, understand, and support each other.
Okay, great. And so what would you say are some of the most rewarding aspects of your job?
It is, first of all, I have a great job. It really is delightful. It's hard sometimes, but I think helping someone have a new experience of themselves, helping someone be able to speak of a vulnerability that they thought they would just have to carry alone internally forever. Helping someone realize that a partner that they thought was indifferent was actually overwhelmed, not uncaring, helping people have a new experience of themselves. I mean, nobody would really want to hear this, right? This part that I don't even feel good with. Why would, if my partner doesn't really enjoy it when I make my best effort, you're telling me I can go to them and say when I feel fragile and they want to know that, and finding that works, that actually is the emotional glue that helps people come together. So I think being a participant in people's journey towards more self-understanding and shared understanding is amazing. And paradoxically, we might say, because I also do this divorce support work, helping people understand themselves in that process, understand what they become capable of, that they can grow in ways they didn't necessarily expect, is also really joyful.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. When I have my clients and they're coming to me at the most emotionally charged point and helping them through the process and then come out on the other side being so happy and transformed, for me is 5,000 times way more rewarding than anything else I've ever done in my life. And so that's something that I'm passionate about, and the reason why I'm doing this podcast and trying to help as many people, as many as possible who will listen, and being armed with the right information, because I don't think people know that there's emotionally focused therapists out there, or divorce coaches and mediators, all of these different people who can help and be a part of their team. So I think that's important for people to know. And as you know, the name of the podcast is called Klickline, when everything clicks. So I was curious to know, when was there a moment in your personal or professional life where you're like, this clicks and makes sense?
It's a great question. I can think for myself. I'm learning all this, I'm teaching this. And then in my own relationship, I had a moment where I had a real sense of something was going on that I saw for me internally. I was worried about something medically. And I thought, oh my God, am I gonna actually share this with my partner? And I literally, I'm a visual person. So I had an experience where images were flipping upside down in my mind, as I did this. It was so interesting, and I shared this, and my partner responded and said, I'm here with you. You're not going through this by yourself. And it turned out that it was fine, but I didn't know at the time that it was going to be fine. And I had that sense. It's like you take a risk and you share a vulnerability that you have not done before. You don't have an experience that says, I know this is going to work out perfectly. I have an idea, and I've seen other people do it. But until you do it yourself, it's kind of like looking at swimming. It looks really beautiful. But if you've never been in that water.
And we all think we can do the butterfly until we try.
Right? Until you've been in the water. It's kind of like, that's hard at the beginning, right? So feeling that sense of that the vulnerability actually made things stronger was really fantastic.
Thank you for sharing that, because as you're a professional who trains and coaches clients, it's, kind of reassuring to know that you also have these, moments of, should I share it or not? And taking that risk on vulnerability is also something that's emotional for you as well. Because, I think of you as a professional, all of these, different aspects, but we're all human at the end of the day, right?
Right. There's knowing it, and then there's experiencing it. Yes. And we do, part of the way I train is it's an experiential training where people are actually doing role plays and trying this on and feeling their way through it, because the closer we can get to the experience, the better we'll be able to do it with other clients.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being on the Klickline.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Don't forget to send in your questions and comments to the Klickline. And one more thing, the views and opinions expressed on this podcast are for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. Please consult with qualified professionals for advice related to your specific situation.